Hello, this is Adam Pawson welcoming you to this Bite-Size Bio webinar. Today's presentation is titled From Submission to Print, Getting the Best Out of the Peer Review Process, and is being presented by Dr. Laura Grassie, Content Creation Manager at Bite-Size Bio. Laura received her PhD in molecular biology from the University of Dundee before moving into the world of scientific publishing. She has previously worked as an assistant editor for the journal Genome Biology, and has held various other roles in scientific publishing. Her contributions to Bite-Size Bio began during her PhD when she started writing articles. She is now the Content Creation Manager at Bite-Size Bio, where she has the pleasure of interacting with science writers at all levels, from those just beginning their careers to writers who are now well established. As always, we will have a question and answer session after the presentation, so please type any questions that you have into the questions box, which you can access from the bottom panel of your screen, and I'll put them to Laura at the end of the presentation. A link to view the recording of this presentation will be sent to you in due course. So now over to you, Laura, for the presentation.
Yes, so today we're going to be talking about how to get the best out of the peer review system. So first of all, let's go through what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all is the first steps, and these involve how do you actually go about choosing the right journal for you. Then we'll talk about how you correctly format your article, how to go about submitting your article, what actually happens to your article once it's submitted to a journal, what happens once your article is accepted, and finally, common mistakes that are made at every step and how to prevent these in order to make sure the peer review system goes as smoothly and as well as possible. So here I've just made a little flow diagram showing you everything that happens in the peer review system, right from the beginning where you choose a journal. You then need to prepare your manuscript based on the journal that you've chosen before submitting it. Once it's submitted, it first goes through editorial assessment, which decides whether or not it's suitable for the journal, and they decide whether or not to reject it outright or to send it to publication, send it for peer review, sorry. Once it gets sent to peer review, depending on what the peer reviewers say, you might undergo revisions, and then based on these revisions have additional reviews either by the editors or by the peer reviewers themselves again, and then hopefully after all this your manuscript will be accepted and it will get published. So let's go through each of these steps in detail. So the first thing to realize is there are literally thousands of journals out there. With the dawn of online publishing, the number of journals has really boomed in the last few years, meaning that it's really quite difficult to figure out what journal you actually want to and should publish your research in. So how do you go about, from all these thousands of journals, picking the one that you want to submit your precious paper to? Well, the first thing is to think about the scope of your paper. There is no point submitting a paper on the mating patterns of African birds to the Journal of Virology. It's simply not going to be accepted. So you really have to make sure that the topic of your paper is really suitable for the journal. That's an extreme situation that I mentioned there, but again, you want to make sure that what you're publishing is within the scope of the journal. So how do you find out what the scope of the journal is? Well, first of all, check out the author guide. All journals have this, and in there's usually a section that tells you what they consider the scope of the journal to be. Another thing is to actually look at the papers that they publish. Are they related to what you publish? If so, there's a good chance that it's the right journal for you. If you don't actually have a journal in mind, there's other ways to find journals that are within the right scope for your paper. First thing is to look at related papers. So papers that are related to the work that you're publishing, and obviously a good place to do this is to actually check out your reference list. Have a look at the papers that are very close to what you're publishing, especially the ones that have been published in the last few years. Where are they published? And that's a good idea of journals that will be suitable for your own paper. Another thing to think about is the actual type of paper that you're trying to publish, especially if it's a more specialized paper such as a methods. Not all journals accept methods papers, so make sure that where you're submitting it actually accepts the article type that you're looking to publish. The other thing you want to think about is the impact, and this is where you have to be really honest with yourself and your work. Everybody wants to be able to publish amazing high impact research, but it's not true that every paper that you're going to write is going to be that high impact paper. So be honest with yourself. What is the impact of your paper? Is it very specialized, in which case you really should be looking at the more specialized journals which do have lower impact factors? Or is it broad interest? And again, be really brutal to yourself with this. If it really is broad interest, then great, go for one of those broad interest journals that tend to be higher impact. But it's really critical here that you pick the right one, because you also want to make sure that the audience that you're sending it to are the people that you want to read the paper. If it's very specialized, it's not going to be interest to a lot of people, and therefore outside of a specialized journal, it might not get as much as attention as you'd like. Another thing that needs to be considered is novelty. Again, you have to be quite brutal with yourself here. How novel is your paper? Is it just an incremental increase on something that's been published before? Again, in which case it's not really going to be suitable for one of those really high impact journals. If it's completely new and out there, has big impact, then you're likely looking at, yes, go for one of these high ones. But if not, be honest with yourself and send it to somewhere that's likely to actually have it accepted. Another thing that you really should consider is funding considerations. And this is something a lot of people may forget about when they actually come to submitting their paper. Some funding bodies will ask that you submit your research that's funded through them in an open access journal. Now, this doesn't mean that you actually have to only publish in an open access journal, as many paywall journals now offer an open access route. There may also be specific journals that are requested or recommended by your funding body, but check, because this is quite a rare situation, but it's worth double checking before you submit your manuscript anywhere. So these are just a few hints and tips for how to choose the best journal, but it really is quite a difficult thing to do, but really important to making sure that your paper has the best chance of getting published. We actually held a webinar in our last webinar festival called Choosing the Best Journal for Your Paper, and this entire webinar is dedicated to that particular topic. So I'd really recommend, if you're having trouble figuring out what journal to publish in, go to our webinar section and check out this webinar. So the next thing that you want to do when you're preparing your manuscript is, you've decided on the journal that you want to submit it to. The first thing you should do is read the guide to authors. I cannot stress this enough. Every journal out there has a guide to authors. They're normally very easy to find on the website, but if not, email the editors and they'll direct you to it. The guide to authors is your lifeline when submitting a paper. It has all the details you could possibly want to know about how to submit and what you need to know in order to submit. So here I've generated a word cloud by putting together some of the several guide to authors from some of the top journals. And you can see here some of the big words that are popping out: article, figure, data, information, appropriate, include. And this really highlights what the guide to authors really does for you. So we'll just go through some of the things that the guide to authors will actually provide. So the first thing is, it will give you an indication of length. Some journals will limit you on how long your article can be, and this can be a really critical factor, as if they have strict guidelines, they won't let you publish the article if it goes over that. And if you send in an article that's particularly longer, then you need to, if you send in an article that's particularly longer, then you need to have it cut down, which at some point may cause you to delay the publication of your paper, which isn't very good. The next thing is structure. Now, you might think you understand the structure of a paper really well, but this can actually differ greatly between journals. Some of them like only a very baseline materials and methods in the actual publication, and much more detailed ones in the supplementary material. How your abstract is format might differ from journal to journal. So make sure you check this out, even if you think you know what the structure should be. Figures. Again, this is a really critical thing. This is really kind of the bread and butter of your paper as well. So you want to make sure that the figures are formatted the way they ask, and in particular, when you upload them, that they're uploaded in a file type that the journal accepts. Data is a big one, especially nowadays with lots of research coming out with big data files and data sets like genome sequencing or RNA sequencing data or microarray data. Many journals have a policy about if this data needs to be shared with the public and which repositories it needs to go to. So have a look in there, because data submission to these repositories can actually take quite a long time. And if you don't start it at the beginning of the submission process, this could cause really delays to the publication of your paper. It'll also give you details about the article types that the journal accepts, and also how the submission process will go. Details of what will happen during the review process, including the normal number of reviewers that it will see, and perhaps a timeline on how they expect the review process to take, but be aware that this is dependent on the reviewers as well. It'll also detail all the document types that you can upload. For example, can it accept LaTeX? Do you have to submit it as a doc? Can you submit it as a PDF? Most journals will want an editable file of some type at some point, so it's good to make sure you have this from the start. Even if they initially let you submit a PDF, it's likely they will need an editable copy further down the line. So check whether this needs to be in a Word doc or whether LaTeX is available if that's what you've formatted your paper as. It'll also give you details about supplementary information, what can and cannot be included in there, and if there's any limitations to the size of this, and also details about the materials and methods. There may be specific things that they want you to include in materials methods, such as sequences for primers or siRNA, or details of the antibodies that you've used. Okay, so you've picked your journal and you've read the guide to authors. Now it's time to actually submit your paper. So one of the things that many people don't realize that you can actually do is something called a pre-submission inquiry. You can only submit your paper to one journal at a time, and this is very strict. Journals will ask you to confirm that this has not been submitted anywhere when you submit your paper to them. But this can make it difficult, especially if you've got a few journals that you want to submit to and you're not quite sure which one you submit to first. In which case, you can send around pre-submission inquiries to many journals, and these give you an idea about whether or not they feel that your paper would be suitable for them. You don't submit the whole paper in this. Instead, you tend to just submit a summary, and they'll get back to you on whether or not it's suitable for their journal. Please note, if you get a favourable pre-submission inquiry, a favourable answer back, this doesn't mean that your paper will definitely be accepted or even sent to review. It's just an idea that likely the scope is suitable for the journal. The next thing is that you want to submit it using the system that the journal has in place. Majority of journals now have online submission systems, and this just makes it a lot easier for the journal and the editors to actually handle your manuscript. These people deal with many manuscripts, and it's hard to keep track of them all, and therefore they have these systems in place. What you absolutely shouldn't do is email the editors with your article. Unless it clearly states in the guide to authors that this is acceptable, this won't actually be counted as a submission. And again, it will waste precious time in you submitting your article. So what will you be asked for when it comes to submit? You need to make sure you have these things in advance when it comes to submission. So obviously you'll be asked for the title. You'll also be likely asked for a cover letter. This isn't always mandatory, but I think it's a really good idea to include this. You'll also be asked for the author details. Some journals will actually ask you for the emails of all authors that you've listed, and likely also the order of authors. They may also ask you for the corresponding author, but be careful because this can be tricky. It could mean one of two things. It could either mean the corresponding author that people who read the paper once it's published can contact, or it might mean the corresponding author that the journal will deal with during the submission process. So maybe just clarify this if it isn't clear. They'll obviously ask you for your manuscript, any figures, and figures can differ with where they're uploaded. So some journals will ask you to embed your figures within the manuscript and upload them, and others will ask you to submit these separately. Another thing that some people who haven't gone through the process of publishing on paper before don't realize is that you may actually be asked by the journal, is there any reviewers that you want to suggest to review your paper? They also ask you if there's anyone that you want to exclude. And I'll talk about this a little later on. So there's several common mistakes that happen during submission. The first one really relates to the cover letter. Don't just rehash your abstract here. Often the editors will be able to see your abstract anyway, so just rehashing it in the cover letter is just wasting space and an opportunity to really talk about your work and why it's suitable for the journal. Give a personal approach here. What do you think about your research is suitable for the journal that you're submitting to? Cover letter submission isn't always mandatory, so therefore you might have the option of not submitting one. I think this is a common mistake, as it's missing out an opportunity to talk directly to the editors and explain why your paper is so interesting and suitable for their journal. So I think you should always take this option. Your cover letter should be as important to you as your manuscript. It's likely one of the first things that their editors will see, and having lots of spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes will give a bad impression. It won't affect whether or not your article actually goes through review, but you want the editors on your side and you want to have a professional feel to your article, and this includes the cover letter as well. Surprisingly, this is one that I saw a lot as an editor, is people submitting cover letters with the wrong journal name in. And this makes you wonder as an editor, did they mean to send it to us? But usually they do. The reason that you want to be careful of this, and the likelihood of why it happens, is that people may have submitted their article to another journal and had it rejected, and they just use the same cover letter again. By doing this, you're letting the journal know it's likely that you had your paper rejected from somewhere else. And while this won't affect the review process or whether or not your article goes through review, you're giving them information they don't necessarily need to have. Another thing that won't affect whether or not your article goes through review, but is still good to be aware of, is having the wrong editor name or the name spelt incorrectly on the cover letter. Again, you're trying to give a very professional opinion of yourself to these people just on a piece of paper or, electronically. So be careful to make sure you use the right editor name. If you want to use the editor name, make sure you check on the website and know the current editor. Or if in doubt, just use Dear Editors. There are other common mistakes that happen during the submission. For example, with your article, you might submit a wrong document type. As I mentioned before, if you submit a methods paper to a journal that doesn't accept methods, it's going to be rejected. The other thing is the wrong document format. Again, reading the guide to authors is really critical here. Make sure you know whether or not they accept the type of format that you're sending, for example, a docx or a PDF. And I've mentioned this before, but the incorrect length. This could cause the journal to actually go back to you and say, you need to change the length of this before we'll consider it for publication. Or if they will take it under consideration to begin with, you will likely have to cut it down later in the process, which can take extra time. Again, submitting your figures incorrectly. As I mentioned, some journals do differ in the way they like figures to be submitted. This includes naming conventions for figures, the types of figures that you can upload, and whether or not they're uploaded separately or as part of the document. So again, just check this before you do. The other thing that journals have that differ between them is the referencing system that they use. There are many different referencing systems out there, and again, the referencing system used by your journal that you're submitting to will be detailed in the guide to authors. And again, you can see which one from the actual articles that have been published previously. Make sure you use the right reference system for the journal. Again, it's not really going to affect you in the initial stages of the review process, but it will take more time down the road. And this is especially true if for some reason you haven't used a reference manager, because changing a reference system from Harvard to Vancouver or vice versa can take an inordinate amount of time. And again, you just want to make sure that there's no spelling errors. So have someone proofread your article before you actually submit it. Other incorrect or common mistakes is giving incorrect author details. Many journals will actually email all the authors to let them know that they've had their name submitted on a paper. This just prevents people from adding people fraudulently, for example, a big name to help you try and get your paper published. And people will be emailed to let them know this happens. So make sure that all the authors that you have on the paper know that they have their names on the paper and that you give their correct details. As I mentioned before, depending on how the journal asks for this, you want to make sure that the right person is the one that's going to be handling the paper throughout. Normally what happens is the account that you log in is the account and submit the paper through is the account of the person that the journal will contact through the whole submission process, because they won't contact all the authors, they'll just contact one. So make sure if you want someone else to actually handle the submission of the paper, that they are the people who should be handling everything from getting the reviewers' comments and talking to the editors. Submitting to multiple journals is not acceptable. You likely have the chance of having your paper rejected from all the journals that you've submitted to if it's found that this occurs, so just don't do it. As I've said, there's the option of pre-submission inquiries if you do want to, if you are unsure which journal to send it to initially, but you must only submit your paper to one journal at a time. Once it's been rejected from a journal, you're of course then free to submit it elsewhere, but not until. Many people don't realize that when they're submitting the paper, and especially when they're publishing the paper with a journal, they may be giving over certain rights. For example, they may be signing over copyright of their article to a journal. So make sure you read through the terms and conditions carefully. This will detail things about who you need to include in terms of the author list, and also whether or not you will be handing over copyright. Once you've submitted your article, you are faced with the first hurdle, and this is the editor review. So depending on how journals are organized, and it does depend journal to journal, it does differ. Some will have a team of onboard editors that review the manuscripts, and some will have academic staff who work as academics elsewhere. These people will review your paper for several things, including what I've already talked about before, which is scope, making sure it's actually suitable for the journal, how novel it is, and again, the level of novelty will depend on the journal itself, and every journal will have a different acceptable level of novelty and a different level of impact. And another thing that they may check for at this stage or at later stages of the review process, depending on the journal, is plagiarism. So I just want to talk a little bit more about this. Plagiarism is something that should be avoided at all costs. It can severely affect your career, but many people don't fully understand what plagiarism is. So journals actually have software that they use to check your submitted article against all the articles that have been published out there. These include software like Authenticate or Crosscheck, but there's other software available. And these pick up things including self-plagiarism. And this is something where a lot of authors get caught up on. A lot of people don't realize that they can't simply take text from one of their own previously published papers and just transplant it into a new paper. That's still considered plagiarism, even though it's your own words. It's something that's known as self-plagiarism, and this still needs to be avoided at all costs. So therefore, make sure that if you are taking sections or want to reuse sections, that you actually change them so they're no longer plagiarized. These software are actually pretty clever. They don't just look for identical matches of text, but they can actually detect text that's very similar in content. For example, maybe just smaller words have been changed. So even if you have plagiarized something but thought, I'll change a few words here and there, this software can still detect it. It'll also detect uncredited quotes. You have to make sure that for any quotations you include in your manuscripts, that you properly cite the source that you took it from, and that also you see whether or not there's any copyright associated with reproducing that quote. And copyright is something I'll come on to in a minute. These software also check all articles that have been published, and this includes articles that are paywalled, so that not everyone might have access to. So just be aware, they really do check everything. So if you've managed to pass that the first hurdle and the editors think that your paper is suitable for publication, they will send it out to reviewers. And here is where we go back to the fact that the journal may actually ask you to suggest reviewers to review your paper. They also may ask you if there's any particular people that you want to exclude. So when it comes to suggested reviewers, pick people that are relevant in your field, not just your friends. Journals do have ways of checking whether or not reviewers are suitable, even if they're ones that you have suggested. And just because you've suggested people doesn't mean the journals will necessarily pick those people to review your paper. And I'll talk a little bit of why they might not do that. When it comes to review exclusions, this is a good way if you know of a particular group that's working on something very close to you and you don't want them to see your paper or your data before it's published. You can say that, give their names, and journals are generally very good at excluding these reviewers. However, use this leniently. You don't want to submit 15 names because it's likely the journal will come back to you and say, that's too many people to exclude, you really need to narrow it down. Keep it to just legitimate reasons of you feel that their work is too close to yours to review it subjectively. So another thing that many people wonder about is how many reviewers will actually review their paper. And it really does vary to journal, but in general you'll have at least 2 reviewers review your paper, although there may be more. This can be depending on the expertise. So for example, if your paper bridges 2 different topics or 2 different fields, it's likely the journal will try and find reviewers from those individual fields so they can properly review the whole paper. And they may actually get more than 2 reviewers to do this. So I mentioned before that the journal may not actually invite anyone that you suggest. And this is because there's been a massive problem in recent years of fake peer reviewers. This is where there's very different varieties of this, but one of them is where authors have actually created false email accounts and names and put themselves forward under these nom de plumes as potential reviewers in a way to try and get their manuscript favorably reviewed and published. However, journals are very good at picking up on this, as we've seen. Retraction Watch is a great website if you haven't been to it. It details all the things like manuscripts that get retracted or malpractice in publications by authors, an example. So journals can pick up on this, and many journals therefore may not actually go with the suggestions that you provide. Journals have many different criteria that they will use when they pick reviewers, including possibly excluding people that you work with in your department, people that you've published with in the last number of years, and also people that they know you have a strong relationship to. Editors may be around for years and get to know people in the field. So they do try their best to avoid situations like this. So you absolutely cannot guarantee that just because you ask for someone to review a paper they're going to, because of issues like this. So what happens with the reviewer's comments? Well, depending on what the reviewers say, the editors can choose to reject the manuscript, they can ask you to resubmit it with corrections, or just very minor corrections in which they'll say it's accepted in principle as long as these corrections take place. How do you deal with reviewers' comments? Well, the first thing is to be very polite. It can be upsetting, especially if they've asked you for significant changes to your work, or maybe pulled out points that you find unpleasant. Also make sure that you address all points. Often you'll have a detailed list from the editors based on what the reviewers have said, asking for a detailed list of what you need to address. Make sure that you address every single one of these points. Of course, there may be times where you think some of the points are unfair or not reasonable or not within the scope of the particular article that you've submitted. You still need to address them, even if it's just in words. State clearly, calmly, and precisely why you feel this isn't the case. If you also have any concerns about your reviewer, raise this again professionally with the editors and explain why you have concerns. Have they said something that makes you think that they haven't understood your paper? In which case the editors may get an opinion of another reviewer, or actually send the comments of reviewer 1 to reviewer 2 if that was the issue, to see whether or not their comments are justified. But the main thing is, when replying to reviewers' comments, be polite, address all the points, and do it professionally, even though this can be quite an emotive part of peer review. So you've got through the first round and you've done your revisions. Be aware that when it comes to revisions, Journal may impose a time frame for you to do these by in order for them to accept the revisions of the paper. And there's good reasons for this. Once a journal accepts your paper, they generally won't then reject it based on novelty if another paper comes out on a similar topic, because it's already in the system. However, if you go over this time frame that they've suggested to you or told you to get the revisions in, it then allows them to actually reject it based on novelty. Because otherwise people could take months or even years to make the revisions, and in which case the paper could be outdated. Once you have your revisions and you send them back in, they will go to the editors to review. The editors will then decide whether or not, in their opinion, you've addressed the reviewers' comments enough to either A, send it back to the reviewers if it needs to be seen by them again, or actually say, that's great, we'll accept it for publication. It may go back to the reviewers a second time, and you may get a second batch of comments from the reviewers, and this will be often stating whether or not they feel that you've addressed their comments. They cannot usually at this point raise new issues unless it's with a new thing that you've added to the manuscript. That should all be done at the first stage. So if you're finding that reviewers are now bringing up other comments that should have been done in the first round, highlight this to the editors, or the editors should be looking out for this themselves. Hopefully at this point you've got your paper accepted. Congratulations. Is that it? Is it all done and over? No, not quite. There's still some things that need to happen to your manuscript. The first thing is the format, and I'll say it again, read the guide to authors. If you haven't, and you haven't formatted your manuscript correctly, this stage could be quite painful, as you have to change maybe the length, the layout, the structure, and the reference list. However, if you've been good and read the guide to authors from the beginning and formatted it correctly, this will be generally a painless process. The next thing is obviously to consider the data, especially these big data. If you haven't already, this will be the point where the editors are asking you where your data is submitted and what the accession numbers are, and it's likely that they will need these to be included in the manuscript and this data to be live before they publish the article. Copyright here is where this will be checked by most journals. It may be checked earlier on as well, but this really is the last stage to check that everything's in place with the copyright. And finally, your article will also go through something called copy editing. So I'll talk to you about each of these before. As I mentioned before, formatting, you should have read the guide to authors. If you haven't, read it now and make sure your article fits. When it comes to data, especially big data, there's lots of repositories out there, and most journals will tell you the repositories that they accept data to be stored in. So for example, for protein sequences, this can be UniProt. For DNA and RNA sequences, it can be the ENA, the Protein Data Bank, UniProt again. Sequencing data, there's lots of different repositories such as NCBI Trace and Short Read Archive, or the ENA Sequence Read Archive for short reads, and for more deep sequencing, GEO and Array Express. Also, they may ask you for things if you've got CNVs or SNPs to submit them in databases. These aren't the only data that journals might ask you to submit to data repositories. This is just an example of some of them. And these aren't all the repositories available out there. Check with the journal what data needs to be submitted and try and do this as early as possible, and make sure that you are submitting it to a repository that the journal accepts. There may be specific repositories that they accept simply because those repositories guarantee that their data will be around for X number of years. Make sure you get the accession numbers because it's likely that these will be required for publication. It may also be likely that your data is asked to be open access, so once your data is published with the accession number, anyone can go on and access this raw data. However, there are exceptions for this, especially for sensitive data, such as from patients or humans. In this case, exceptions may be made either that it doesn't have to be put in a repository at all, or in repositories that have special walls that only certain researchers can access. So here I'm just going to touch a little bit on copyright. I'm not going to go too much in depth of this, but it is an important point of the publishing process. Certain things are subject to copyright, including figures, tables, text, including materials and methods. If you're using figures, tables, or text from another publication, and this can include your own, you need to make sure that you are allowed to reproduce those. Common mistakes that happen is people will say, it's only one image, it's only one table or quote, I don't need to ask copyright for that. That's not true. You have to go back and check that the journal that you're taking this data from, or these figures or tables or text, and see whether or not it's copyright. And if so, it's likely that you will need permission to reproduce anything from that paper. Some people will say, well, I gave the source, surely that's enough. I haven't said that it's my own, I've said it's from somewhere else. That's still not permission to reproduce. Another thing that a really common misconception about copyright is if it's a paper that you've published previously and it's a figure that you want to reuse, maybe a diagram, surely you can just reuse it. You created that figure. No. You may have handed over copyright of everything in that paper when you published it with a previous journal. Therefore, even if it is your own work, you may have to seek permission to reproduce. Many journals will allow authors to reproduce their own work, but you have to check this for the individual author, and you still may need to get permission details from that journal to show the new journal where you're submitting. Another common misconception is that if an article is open access, anything in it is free to use. This is not true. While a lot of open access articles are covered by what's known as the Creative Commons license, which does allow reproducing of figures and tables up to a certain degree, this is not true for all open access. So make sure you check with the individual journal. Many other people think it's the journal's job to sort out copyright. You're the ones that are including these figures in your manuscript. Therefore, at the end of the day, it comes up to you to show that you have permission to get and reproduce any figures that you've taken from other sources. So how do you go about getting permission? Well, actually, it's pretty easy. A lot of journals now have automated systems that make it really easy for you to get permission to reproduce figures, text, or tables. You can find permission sections in most online journals now, and they're pretty easy to access. Here, for example, I've taken a screenshot of an article listed in a table of contents for a particular journal, and they actually have a little permissions link here. And this links to one of the commonly used permissions programs called RightLink. When you click on this, you get something like this, which details the paper, and a few drop-down menus asking you what you want to reproduce, and that for some cases you may have to pay for reproductions, but depending on what it is you're actually reproducing, it may also be free. And this could give you permissions within the hour, but not all journals do this. So again, you want to check what systems the journals have, because permissions can be quite tricky to obtain in certain cases. If in doubt though, just don't include figures, text or tables from previous journals. It'll save you a lot of headache and possibly a lot of money as well. But if you absolutely need to do this, make sure you have permission to reproduce them. So the last step I mentioned was something called copy editing. So a lot of people really don't understand what this step is. So obviously copy editing goes through things like the spelling and the grammar of your article to make sure that's all correct. It'll also, though, go a bit deeper than that. First of all, to make sure that your article actually makes sense. They'll also maybe point out missing references to figures and tables, if there's possibly incorrect values. For example, if you've got simple addition in a table but they don't quite add up. They might also point out incorrect references in a reference list, and also whether your reference formatting is incorrect, and may correct this for you. But please note that the level of copy editing will vary from journal to journal, and at the end of the day, it's still up to you to make sure your article's up to scratch. So don't rely purely on the copy editor. They'll also look at the length, but again, when it comes to length, it's likely they will ask you to review that because that involves lots of chopping and changing to a manuscript. So what are the common mistakes during the copy editing stage? First of all is assuming copy editors know your work as well as you do. Copy editors may make a mistake when they change certain things in your paper that means that the meaning has been lost from what you originally intended to. Therefore, you should be very careful that when you go through a copy edited version of your manuscript, that any changes that have been made, and all changes should be highlighted to you, that they don't change the meaning of anything that you're stating. You are the person that knows your paper the best, and while the copy editor may have been trying to make it make more sense, they may have lost the meaning. Again, assuming that the copy editors of the journals have full responsibility to spotting errors and mistakes. I'm sure you've heard in the news where there's often comments that are left in incorrectly, or things that are just out of place in journal or articles that actually get published. It's not just down to the journals to do this. You should always make sure you see a final copy of your article to approve before it's published. Another thing is for people to actually harass copy editors, to have a go at them for changing their work. A journal article is obviously incredibly personal to people who've spent maybe possibly years working on this, and then they've written it, and it's a lot of time to put this article together, and then to see some people change what you've written, it can be quite emotive. But just make sure you don't have a go at these people. They're just trying to do the job, and they're actually trying to make sure that your article is as best as it can be. Be understanding. If there's something that they've changed that you don't agree with, state this in a polite manner. Or if there's something you don't understand why they've changed, just ask. Once your article is published, there may also be a couple of things that happen as well. First of all, it may be indexed in an index like PubMed, and this may take a couple of days. And also, a lot of online journals now will publish your article as is first, and then it will go through copy editing before a final PDF is created. This can actually take a significant amount of time. So try not to get stressed and contact the journal angrily if you don't have a final PDF. So just to summarize what I've talked about today. Read the guide to authors. This is possibly the biggest takeaway thing from here. So many authors don't read the guide correctly when it actually provides pretty much all the information you need to know about submitting your article to a particular journal. Get everything proofread. That includes emails that you send to the journal, cover letters that you send, and any correspondence. Being well prepared means that you know when it comes to submission that you have your article formatted correctly, that you have everything that the journal will ask for, and everything's done correctly, such as depositing data in a repository. Be polite and professional. Yes, we understand as editors that it can be highly emotive for you, especially if you've got deadlines because you need something published for a certain grant application or maybe even the ref. But we are trying to work as halves. We're not here to try and hamper you, we're trying to help you. But if you're abusive to us, it's going to make us less likely to want to give you as much attention as we can. So just be polite and professional, and we'll be so back. If in doubt, ask the editors. If there's something that you can't find online, if there's something that you're not sure about's happening, even if you know your manuscript's in review, but it's taking a little bit longer than you thought, just politely email the editors and ask what's going on. They'll likely respond to you pretty quickly. And like I've said before, read the guide to authors. So that's everything from me. I hope that's helped you understand the peer review process a little better and highlighted a few of the things that can often be people's downfalls in this submission process. And I will take any questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Laura. That was a very insightful journey through the peer review process. We have a few questions from the audience. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to post these into the questions box, which you can access from the bottom panel of your screen. So, Laura, the first question that's come in is, if my paper has been rejected, can I resubmit it to the same journal?
Yeah, so that really depends on which journal it is that you've submitted it to and what their reasons are for rejecting it. If their reasons are that it's not novel enough, then yes, you're probably not going to want to keep resubmitting it to the same journal unless you've done something dramatic to it to make it more novel. However, if it could be that they wanted more work done on it and they felt that was rejecting outright was the right thing to do in that case, but it might be if you do that work, then you can resubmit it to the journal. The best thing to do is to check with the individual journal. The editors will be the ones that are best able to answer that question for you.
Great, thanks. The next question, if I'm a co-author, will I be informed if my manuscript is accepted or published?
So again, this varies journal to journal, so it's always best to check in with the individual journal. But most journals they have a corresponding author or a main author that they deal with. Even if you're corresponding author on the paper, it might not, if there's joint corresponding authors, there might still just be one author that the journal is dealing with directly. It's quite hard sometimes to deal with multiple authors, especially on some of the papers where there's 50 or 100 different authors. So the journal in general will just work with one direct contact. However, there should be at some stage a point where everyone who is listed as an author on that paper gets contacted by the journal, just so those people know that they are named as an author on that paper. But if you are a co-author, either speak to the person who you know is corresponding to the journal, or you can email the journal directly as well, and they should be able to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you. So Laura, I know you touched on this at the beginning of your presentation. Someone's asked, is there any site that which can help us find a suitable journal for our work? As a beginner, we don't know which journal is good for us.
Yeah, so actually, I don't know how many people know this, but a lot of the publications in the scientific world are actually published by just a few publishers, like, for example, Elsevier or Springer. There's just a few publishing houses that actually own most of the journals, and they actually tend to have a few of them do have sites that, if you just look on have a Google or look on their sites, have sites where you can say paste your title and abstract, and it will give you suggestions of journals that might be suitable to publish in. So that's one way that you can do it. Obviously, there's other ways that I mentioned in terms of looking at your own reference list, looking at papers that are similar to yours, speaking to colleagues around you and getting their opinions. All of these things are good, and you probably should do all of them. I wouldn't rely solely on a website to tell me what to do. And something to remember is when you're using those, they probably don't include every single journal, and certainly the publisher ones will only be for journals by that publisher. So you're not getting the full picture of things that might be suitable for you.
Okay, thank you. So this next question is probably something that a few people might experience. What should I do if I feel a review from a reviewer is unfair or biased?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that happens a lot, that authors may feel that way. Whether or not it's the case that it is biased or unfair is it depends on the circumstances. So all I can say is maybe write a nice email, or just write an email initially to get your feelings out. Don't send it. Then take a day or two to kind of breathe, go back over it, make it polite, and just address with the editors why you feel that is the case. Editors are there to listen. There are certainly cases where reviewers are unfair. After all, reviewers are human. They might have their own biases. They might be having a bad day. Obviously, we hope that's not the case, but it certainly does happen. But the best way to handle that is in a calm and polite way to the editors, and lay out your case as to why you feel that review is biased. They will look at this, they will look into it, and quite often they will get a third reviewer so that they can get a proper picture on this. So just stay calm and speak to the editors.
Okay, thank you. So this next question, Laura, I'm not sure about it myself, but publishing can be quite expensive for researchers. So this question is, can I publish my paper in a high impact journal for free? Is this an option?
So I think money and publishing is a really difficult thing to kind of go into, and it's quite a complicated one as well. I know a lot of people feel out there that they have spent the money and the time doing this research. It's been funded by funding bodies, and it should be made available for free for people, and I can completely understand that sentiment. However, I think there's a lot that goes into the peer review process that people aren't aware of. And yes, I know there's also the argument of, well, the reviewers do this for free. But the actual process for the editors, especially high impact journals, the number of papers that those editors have to review in a day is astounding. And every rejected paper still has to be looked at, still has to be assessed. And that's what you need to have a fair peer review system. You don't want people just picking papers randomly and deciding, we'll just throw these third of the pile in the bin because we don't have time to look at them. And unfortunately, that costs money. So no matter what you do, it is going to cost somewhere, somehow, to publish your paper. That being said, whether the cost comes out of your pocket is dependent on the journal and what they request. Some journals are paywalled, so how much they ask for, normally it is going to be a fee that you pay, but it might be that your grant that you have includes money to publish. It could be, if you look at your institute, that there is a fund available for helping you publish articles. And the cost of publishing will depend greatly on the type of publication that you're going for. Impact factor is one thing, the level of open access is another. Usually there's different levels of open access. For example, it might be instant open access, or it might be open access after a year, or it might be completely paywalled. And normally the higher level of open access will be more expensive. So that's something to take into consideration. But just speak to your institution, your funding bodies, and the journal themselves, that if you are struggling to pay for publication in a good journal, there are lots of solutions out there.
Okay, thank you, Laura. This next question is probably quite relevant to a lot of young researchers. How can I learn how to peer review a manuscript? Are there training courses for this?
There's certainly courses online. But the best thing that you can do really when it comes to reviewing papers is, one, read as many papers as possible. Two is ask people in your department or colleagues that you know, can you review your paper? Offer to review their papers before they submit into journals and give them feedback. That can really help hone your skills. Ask as well, one of the most common things that happens to get new reviewers into journals, because obviously journals are always looking for new reviewers. One of the things is quite often is we may email someone and say, oh, would you review this paper? And they go, actually, I don't have the time, but I do have this postdoc, or someone in my lab who I think would be brilliant to review this paper. Can I send it to them and I will oversee it? So speak to your supervisor as well. They might give you the opportunities to peer review papers as well with oversight.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Laura, one more question, well, maybe actually a couple more. If one does not receive feedback from reviewers for several months, what can one do? I'd imagine you need to speak to the editor, wouldn't you?
Definitely. So unfortunately, sometimes, and I think it's something, again, that causes quite a bit of pain, is, the system isn't perfect. Reviewers are doing this in their own time. Journals certainly do lay down detailed timelines that they expect reviewers to be adhering to, and I can almost guarantee you that the editors are well aware that your paper is not getting the feedback from reviewers, and they are chasing them regularly. But just speak to the editors, they can keep you informed of what's going on, and then it's up to you. Perhaps you want to move it to another journal, or speak to the editors about what's going on. About moving it to another journal, just be aware you're going to have to start that peer review process all over again. It's something that we definitely encountered. People are like, well, if you're not going to review it, I'm going to pull it and submit it somewhere else. But you're likely just going to add more delays to your article if you do that.
Okay, thank you. So Laura, what should I do if, I imagine this happens quite a lot. What should I do if reviewers suggest additional research that might take many months to a year to do in the lab?
So again, it's speak to the editors. So I think the take home from this is not only read the guide to authors, but just speak to the editors, because the editors might not be, the editors don't know the detailed nitty-gritty of every technique and everything that the reviewers are asking to do. So they might have seen what the review is doing to be completely reasonable. However, if you see this as being unreasonable, and definitely out with the time frame, for example, I mentioned that journals will normally give you a time frame to do these changes in. So if they're saying, oh, do these changes in 3 months, but you're like, that's going to take me a year, you need to immediately go back to the editors and explain this to them. It doesn't mean that they'll suddenly go, oh, that's fine, you don't need to do those things. It might be they go back to the reviewers and ask, okay, so what really needs to be done here? Does all this absolutely have to be done? Usually the case will be yes, because they wouldn't have said so anyway. in which case you've kind of got a few options. It will probably be, it won't be accepted unless you've done those changes usually, except in exceptional circumstances. So it might be a case of choosing a lower impact journal or a more specialist journal that is likely to accept it as is with less changes, or you can spend the time making those changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Laura, I think final question we've got. So there are many journals out there, and one question is, how can I know which are the peer-reviewed journals?
So again, read the guide to authors.
Yeah.
The guide to authors will tell you the journal, what the peer review process is in that journal. I guess one of the really, and I guess this is touching on something that is a real problem, unfortunately, in scientific publications, is there are a lot of predatory journals out there. So predatory journals will often not put your paper through peer review. They don't care about whether or not your paper is correct. They don't care about whether or not it is right. They just care about getting your money. And you know, it doesn't look good to have your work in a predatory journal. So if you're reviewing the literature, reading papers, stuff regularly, you should be aware of what is a good journal. And obviously there's boards and lists for impact factors, which gives you a good idea of how journals form. And again, the guide to authors should clearly be telling you what the review process is like. If you're not sure about a journal, if there's a journal that you've not heard of before and you're thinking about submitting it, do your research, look at the other stuff that they've published. Does it look good? Can you find inconsistencies of it? Do those papers appear in things like Retraction Watch and things like that? Of course, retracted papers are actually a sign that the journal is good because they're keeping their eye on it and pulling it when it's wrong. So it's just about doing your research and speaking to colleagues as well. They might have an idea of, oh no, definitely don't deal with that journal, it's a problematic one, or yes, that's a really good journal to read. But again, it's about just knowing the landscape out there.
Okay, well, Laura, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thanks again, Laura, for an excellent presentation and a great discussion. And finally, thanks to you, the audience, for taking the time to attend and listen in. And so until next time, good luck in your paper writing and submissions and your research, and goodbye from all of us at Bite Size Bio.